Hello again, Year 10 historians. We're going to continue looking at the Mabo decision and the aftermath of this momentous event in land rights for Indigenous Australians. Okay, learning goals for today. You're going to know what the Native Title Act 1993 did. You're going to know how the Wick judgment in 1996 limited it. So, to give you a brief summary, remember Eddie Mabo took the Queensland government to court, eventually to the High Court, where he won. That court decision, the Mabo decision 1992, said that the British people settling in Australia did not cancel out native title, so native title existed. So the government decided that, so that was essentially a judge-made law. The government wanted it to be a government-made law, so they made a law called the Native Title Act in 1993. Now, a lot of people, a lot of white farmers were concerned that native title was going to mean that they wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't have their farmland anymore. Eventually, some of the native title stuff that happened in the Act in 1993 got limited, as you'll see. And you're also going to be able to problem solve creatively. We're going to do a little activity on that. Okay, native title. So in response to the court decision, the 1992 Mabo decision, the law was passed, the 1993 Native Title Act. And that act said, it was to clarify the law so that it wasn't a judge-made law, so it was a law made by politicians. It said Indigenous people had to prove traditional connection with the land since 1788. And they had to apply to a new thing set up called the Native Title Tribunal. So this group of people would decide whether or not, yes, you've still got a traditional connection with that land, that's fine, or no, you don't. Obviously, a lot of Indigenous people found it quite ridiculous that they had to prove a traditional connection to land that they'd been living on for tens of thousands of years, but there you go. Right, here is a timeline of native title. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because depending on your screen you might not be able to see how big it is, but basically, yeah, I'm just going to use my little highlighter here, okay? This we've got, Indigenous people who have been living here for 60, 70,000 years. Then the first fleet arrived, 1788. The Racial Discrimination Act was passed in 1975, making it illegal to discriminate against people based on their race. The original court case was held in 1982. That court case went for 10 years. They finally won in the High Court. And then the law was passed, Native Title Act, right here. That's what we're talking about. Some amendments that were made to it, blah, blah, blah. Then there was this other judgment here called the Wick judgment, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then in response to that, the government released a 10-point plan which limited native title. Yep, so that's the main stuff from that timeline. Okay, the Wick case. So the Mabo case was very important for establishing native title. The Wick case was also very important because it limited it. So let's have a look at that. So since settlement, the government, we're talking about since 1788, the government had given farmers, pastoralists, as they were called, leases to land for farming. However, even during this time, Indigenous people still used the land in traditional ways for small-scale hunting, gathering, bathing in sacred waters, for paths, traditional ways. In 1996, there was a court case between the Wick peoples and the Queensland government. This went to the High Court, the highest court in Australia, and it said that pastoral leases don't necessarily end native title. Yeah, so native title could still exist on farmland. Now you can imagine what that meant for farmers. They got the impression this meant that Indigenous people might be able to claim native title on their farmland, and they might lose their farmland, which obviously they didn't want. The Wick case said that native title and pastoral leases could exist at the same time. However, if there was a conflict, the farmers' rights would win. So if the Indigenous traditional land use and the farmers' land use came into conflict in some way. Oh, there's a watering hole. Well, that's our sacred land. We want to use that for these ceremonies. No, I need that because my sheep are going to drink there. There's a conflict. Whose rights take precedence? The Wick case said that the farmers would take precedence, the pastoralists. So, consequences of that were, there was a huge blow to Indigenous people because it said, yeah, you've got native title, but it doesn't count for much. It's not as important as the farmers' rights. That was great for farmers and for politicians voted in by whites worrying about losing their land. And we're going to look at a couple of those politicians now. Here we go. Here's John Howard, who was the Prime Minister at the time. And he said, the pendulum has swung too far the way of Aborigines in the argument. Pauline Hanson, she is the leader of the One Nation Party, which had just got into power for the first time in 96, I think it was. Anyway, she said, this nation is being divided into black and white, and the present system encourages this. I'm fed up with being told, this is our land. Well, where the hell do I go? I was born here, and so will my parents and children. I will work beside anyone, and they will be my equal, but I draw the line when told I must pay and continue paying for something that happened over 200 years ago. Like most Australians, I worked for my land. No one gave it to me. So Pauline Hanson was not happy about native title. Neither was John Howard. But they were happy about the Wick judgment, which limited native title. So, the outcome of the Wick case, the Howard government implemented a 10-point plan which watered down the Native Title Act, which made it weaker, essentially. It meant that much less native title claims were able to be made. Okay? So yes, the Mabo case ended terra nullius, said that Indigenous people did have native title. The Wick case limited it, and then the Howard government implemented this 10. You don't need to go into the details about what those 10 points were. You can look it up if you want. Essentially, the Wick case and the Howard government's actions afterwards limited the native title that Indigenous people could get. It made it harder for them to claim it. So here is a look at where in Australia there is native title currently. There are Indigenous land use agreements, everything that's in brown there. And it's about 15% of Australia's landmass. Keep that in mind. It's going to be a question for our pop quiz coming up. Okay. Okay, people, it's activity time. What I want you to do is come up with one unique, wacky solution to the problem of native title, yeah? So, Indigenous people wanted native title over traditional lands that they've been using for thousands of years, but farmers wanted farmland that they had been using for hundreds of years. What is one really interesting, new, unique solution that you can come up to this problem of native title? Okay, our first video for today is from Behind the News. Take it away.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that the following program contains images of people who have died.
Ghana, Bunjalung, Yonu, and hundreds of others. These are the First Nations of Australia, each with their own language, traditions, laws, and a relationship to land that goes back thousands of years. It's a relationship that's protected by the law, thanks to this guy, Eddie Koiki Mabo. Eddie was a Meriam man, born here on the island of Mer, also known as Murray Island. It's in the Torres Strait, between Queensland and Papua New Guinea. But despite his ancestors having lived there for thousands of years, Mer Island was owned by the Commonwealth of Australia, and had been ever since British settlers arrived. You see, when Captain Cook arrived in Australia, he claimed the country was terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. Of course, that wasn't true, and Eddie knew that. And he spent many years trying to prove that terra nullius was wrong. In the 80s, he and some fellow Murray Islanders, including his wife Benita, took their case to the highest court in Australia. And on the 3rd of June 1992, the High Court made its decision.
The High Court has recognised there were people here and their descendants have rights.
Sadly, Eddie didn't get to see his victory. He died just 5 months earlier. But the impact the Mabo decision had is still felt today. You see, it didn't just affect Meriam people. It meant other Indigenous people could claim native title too. So what is native title? Native title recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' rights and interests in relation to land and waters. That includes things like rights to fish, hunt and practice ceremonies. Native title can't be claimed over private property or areas with public buildings like schools and hospitals. And to claim native title, people have to be able to prove that their ancestors occupied the area before European arrival and continue to practice their culture there. Since the Mabo decision, there have been thousands of native title claims. The Noongar people in Western Australia, Ngarrindjeri people in South Australia, and the Aboriginal peoples of the Wimmera region in Victoria are just a few of the groups who have been granted native title. Many more are still waiting for a decision. And earlier this month, the Ngaliwuru and Ningali people in the Northern Territory were given $2.5 million by the Territory government because the court ruled that their native title had been unfairly taken away when the area was developed. It's the first time the highest court in Australia has put a dollar value on the loss of land and its emotional impact on Indigenous people. And a lot of people say it's a big step forward on the path towards reconciliation.
Our second video today is a video about the anniversary of the Mabo decision. Check it out.
First though, this weekend is the 20th anniversary of the historic Mabo ruling. In June 1992, the High Court brought down its decision recognising the rights of Indigenous people to their traditional lands under their traditional laws. Eddie Mabo was instrumental in the land rights debate and the High Court decision, and his legacy still resonates around the country. Natalie Perhernan reports, and a warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that this story contains images of deceased people.
For Torres Strait Islanders, all life is interwoven and cultural values are expressed in the simplest things.
The island mat is weaved together by pandanus palms. Those weaving will never be broken. It's actually weaved there for this life and for the next life.
This weaving is being made as part of a celebration for a day that has particular significance for the people whose homes are in Australia's most northern waters.
Means a lot for me. A lot for me.
Betty Mabo is a traditional artist who teaches young islanders about their culture and her father's legacy.
Mabo is education, Mabo is community, Mabo is everything. Mabo is everybody's business.
Across the islands, preparations are underway for the 20th anniversary of the Mabo decision.
Mabo Day, for me, especially when the decision was handed down in '92, it's actually about identity. It's about actually the recognition of who I am. It's not just me as a person, it's me identifying in my environment.
It's probably the most important day in the calendar, I think. We believe, Eddie Mabo isn't celebrated enough.
And so, with great reverence, Torres Strait Islanders will pay their respects to the memory of Uncle Koiki. Eddie Koiki Mabo grew up in the Strait on Murray Island. His wife says Eddie Mabo always championed the connection to his spiritual home.
We went up to see all these lands, and so you'd see a certain stone or a certain tree. That's our boundary line. And you go there, and I couldn't believe it, All of what he was saying was right there.
And it's just heaps of rocks. These are small rocks that they've gardened and they picked up, and they put them in heaps on the boundary line, like this. And that can be seen all over Murray Island.
It was not until Eddie Mabo took a job at James Cook University in Townsville that he had the avenue to combine his great passions.
A man who always knew that he was a significant person, you know. He didn't boast or anything, but you always knew from meeting him that, and talking to him, that he saw what he had to say as important.
Eddie Mabo was employed as a gardener, but he sat in on classes and became friends with lecturers.
Henry and I and Koiki were having lunch in Henry's room, and from that time he was talking about the land that he owned, you know, 37 pieces of land all over Murray Island, and water as well, beaches and that. Henry and I looked at each other, and eventually I said, Koiki, you really don't own that land, it's government land. For an instant he just, his eyes wide open and silently said, I'd like to see anyone take that land away from me.
The gardener was invited to lecture about his culture and his people's links to the land.
And if there's any questions that you want to ask, you feel free to do so.
It was as a result of Koiki's speech about how land was inherited on Murray Island that Nugget Coombs and Noni Sharp and others who were there came to the conclusion that this was the right case to go with to the High Court again.
Murray Island itself was a remote location, hard to get to, where custom and tradition had, relatively speaking, been sustained. They wished to assert that the ridiculous proposition that under Australian law they did not own their island, their reefs, their offshore areas. They wanted to assert that that was nonsense. They'd always been there, they'd always owned it.
Eddie Mabo died before the case was resolved.
On his deathbed, that's all he had on his mind was land claim, land case. Yeah, that was his last words.
5 months later, the High Court announced its decision. It had overturned terra nullius. Native title was instituted into law. Murray Islanders had won the battle for ownership of their land, but for them and all Torres Strait Islanders, that was only half the fight. In this culture where for thousands of years survival has been dependent on the bounty of these waters, ownership is inextricably linked with sea rights. This fight has already gone to the federal court and could well be heading to the High Court.
This just becomes a moral decision now about recognising the rights of Torres Strait Islanders in this regard. Koiki started that thing, you know, 30-something years ago. It took a toll on him, you know, and his family, and that sort of thing, you know, you don't want to be wasted. And that's something we need to make sure, you know, we deliver, I think, or we die trying.
Okay, it's reflection activity, and it's a quiz. Oh yeah. Let's do it. 10 questions. Question 1. Where is Mer Island? Question 2. What was Mabo's first name? Question 3. What year was the Mabo court case? Question 4. When was the Native Title Act? No point cheating? You're just testing yourself, yeah? If you don't know it, then you'll learn. Making mistakes, that's how you learn. Okay, question 5. When was the Wick court case? Question 6. Who was the Prime Minister at the time of the Wick court case? Hint. Bushy eyebrows. He had big caterpillars right here. Question 7. Which state were both cases originally heard in? So the Mabo case and the Wick case. They both took a state government to court. Which one? Question 8. Which court made the final decision on both of those cases? The Mabo case and the Wick case eventually went to the something court. Question 9. What political party is Pauline Hanson from? That's my hint. Question 10. What percentage of land in Australia has been legally recognised as belonging to Indigenous people? Okay, give you a couple of seconds to make sure you get an answer to all 10 of those questions. Let's do some answers. Mer Island is in Torres Strait, north of Queensland, in between Queensland and Indonesia. Mabo's first name was Eddie, or Eddie Koiki, if you like. When was the Mabo court case? It was in 1992. When was the Native Title Act? The next year, 1993. The Wick court case was in 1996. Or six. You get the idea. Who was the Prime Minister at the time? It was John Howard. Which state were both cases originally heard in? They were both originally heard in Queensland. Which court made the final decision on both the Mabo and the Wick case? It was the High Court. Highest court in Australia. What political party is Pauline Hanson from? She's from One Nation. And what percentage of land is legally recognised belonging to Indigenous people? 15%. Give yourself a mark out of 10. Should be getting 7 and above for that, I reckon. Yeah. Okay, this is the fun part. It's the homework. Here we go. Answer these questions. What was the importance of the Native Title Act 1993? Make sure to include the question and the answer, so you're going to write the Native Title Act of 1993 was important because... whatever. And why did the Howard government limit it with the 10-point plan? Why did the Howard government decide that he needed to limit native title in Australia? That's your homework. Some of you are keen as beans, and here's some bonus homework for you. Read this. So the National Museum has got this series of important events in Australian history called Defining Moments. I was lucky enough to do some work on some of them. Anyway, check that out. bit.ly/Mabo3030. There's the defining moment about the Mabo court case. Thank you so much for participating in this lesson right here. As I always say, keep it real.